In 1975, Dutch military engineers began building a road toward an American bomber that had been missing for more than 30 years. The road was not leading to a museum, an airfield, or even an ordinary crash site. It stretched roughly 800 meters across wet reclaimed ground toward the remains of a B-24 Liberator that had gone down in the Ysselmeer during the Second World War. There were no boats waiting beside it. No divers were preparing to descend. The aircraft was still where it had crashed, but the lake around it was gone. That was the strange condition of B-24H serial number 427638, known as Big Banner. In December 1943, the place where it would finally be excavated was open water. By the time Dutch recovery crews reached it, that water had been pumped away as part of the creation of Zuidelijk Flevoland. The bomber had not been lifted from the lake. The landscape itself had changed around the wreck. But the disappearance of the lake did not make recovery simple. The former lake bed remained wet, soft, and difficult to cross. Heavy equipment could not simply drive straight to the aircraft. Before anyone could properly excavate the wreck, the Dutch had to build their way toward it, and there was a more important reason for doing so than recovering old aluminum. Wartime records showed that 5 members of Big Banner's crew had never been accounted for. To understand why they were still there, the story had to return to the 22nd of December 1943. Big Banner belonged to the 44th Bomb Group and the 66th Bomb Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces. It was a Ford-built B-24H Liberator, one of the 4-engine heavy bombers operating from Britain against targets in occupied Europe and Germany. That morning, its 10-man crew departed RAF Shipdam in Norfolk as part of a bombing mission against Munster. The pilot was Flight Officer Kent Francis Miller. Beside him sat co-pilot Second Lieutenant Charles E. Taylor. Elsewhere in the aircraft were Navigator Frank Passavant, Bombardier Donald Schaefer, Engineer Edward Burge, Radio Operator James Childers, Turret Gunner Stanley Pilch Jr., Waist Gunners John Larson and Gerald McCord, and Tail Gunner William Sheehan. Big Banner reached the target and released its bombs, but on the return flight the aircraft was damaged by German anti-aircraft fire. It remained airborne, yet it could no longer keep pace with the formation. The B-24 began losing altitude and falling behind as it crossed back toward the Netherlands. At about 2:37 in the afternoon, other aircraft last saw Big Banner descending into cloud. Inside the damaged bomber, Miller ordered the crew to bail out. Men began leaving the aircraft. Later, Taylor remembered that 4 had jumped. The evidence assembled after the war, including the later Dutch investigation, established that 3 men had actually bailed out. They were John Larson, Gerald McCord, and William Sheehan. Then the situation changed. As the remaining crew descended through the cloud, they could see what lay below them. It was not land. They were over the Ysselmeer. The decision to abandon the aircraft had been made when the crew did not have a clear view of the surface. Now they did. The men still aboard faced the prospect of parachuting into cold open water. The continuing bailout was abandoned. Miller would try to put the damaged B-24 down on the lake instead. There was no gentle ending to the flight. Big Banner hit the Ysselmeer hard. The forward section was badly damaged in the impact. The exact sequence inside the cockpit cannot be reconstructed with certainty, and later accounts differ in some of the details. What is clear is that Charles Taylor escaped from the wreck. He made it into the water, reached an inflatable dinghy, and survived long enough to be picked up by a German patrol vessel. He was the only survivor from the 10-man crew. Taylor became a prisoner of war and spent the remainder of the conflict at Stalag Luft 1. For the other men, the story was less complete. Some bodies were recovered from the Ysselmeer after the crash. The 3 men who had bailed out did not survive. But when the wartime accounting was finished, 5 men connected with Big Banner were still missing. They were Kent Miller, Frank Passavant, Donald Schaefer, James Childers, and Stanley Pilch. The bomber remained beneath the Ysselmeer with them. For years, there was little reason to expect that this particular crash site would become accessible. Big Banner had not come down close to an airfield or beside a road. It had disappeared into a large body of water. If anyone were ever to reach it, the obvious assumption would have been that the work would require boats, divers, and underwater salvage equipment. Instead, the Netherlands changed the geography. After the war, enormous land reclamation projects continued around the former Zuiderzee and Ysselmeer. Dikes divided water from future land. Pumping stations removed water from enclosed areas. The exposed bottom slowly became a new landscape. One of those areas was Zuidelijk Flevoland. As the water level fell, ground that had been hidden beneath the lake emerged into daylight. Reeds spread across parts of the new polder. Mud dried unevenly. Some areas became firm enough to work, while others remained saturated and difficult for vehicles. And somewhere in that changing ground was Big Banner. In 1968, aircraft flying over the newly emerging landscape reported what appeared to be the remains of a large wing. Recovery officer Gerrit Zwanenburg went out to investigate. Roughly 6 kilometers east of the Block Van Kuffelaar pumping station, among the reeds and exposed former lakebed, he found aircraft structure. Component markings showed that the wreck belonged to a B-24. That alone did not identify the individual bomber. Many aircraft had been lost during the war, and an isolated section of airframe could not immediately tell investigators which crew had been aboard. Nor was the wreck suddenly easy to recover simply because the water above it had gone. The new polder was still developing. The site remained difficult to reach, and a full extraction would require much more than walking out to inspect a wing. So the aircraft remained where it was. 6 years later, during the dry summer of 1974, Zwanenburg inspected the site again. This time, evidence associated with a rubber life raft gave him what had been missing before, an aircraft number, 427638. The wreck had an identity. It was Big Banner. With the serial number came the wartime record. Investigators could now connect the wreck in the polder to the bomber that had disappeared on the Münster mission in December 1943. They could also connect it to the unresolved part of that loss. 5 men were still missing. The recovery was no longer simply a question of whether an old bomber could be removed from difficult ground. There was a realistic possibility that men who had been missing for more than 3 decades were still with it. In August 1975, the Dutch began preparing to reach them. The first problem was access. Big Banner lay inside terrain that had changed from lake to land on maps, but the physical ground had not become a normal dry field. Much of the former lakebed remained soft enough to make heavy recovery work difficult. Excavators, pumps, and other equipment needed a stable way to approach. On the 18th of August, military engineers began constructing a sand access route from the Oostvaardersdijk toward the wreck. It would extend for roughly 800 meters. The access road was therefore not a convenience. It was the first part of the recovery itself. Until it existed, the team could inspect the site, but could not bring the full weight of a salvage operation to it. Each meter of firm approach changed what could be done next. Equipment and material could finally be brought closer to the wreck without depending entirely on the uncertain ground around it. The closer the route came to Big Banner, the more the operation changed from landscape work into aircraft recovery. What had first appeared from the air as a wing in the reeds was now becoming a defined wreck site. The team could begin separating what belonged to the bomber from the soil that had closed around it, while trying not to destroy the very evidence they had come to recover. That distance explains the strange scale of the operation. The aircraft was visible. It was no longer hundreds of meters beneath water or hidden in a remote mountain range. Men could stand on the new land and know where the B-24 was. Yet reaching it with the machinery needed for a controlled excavation required building an artificial path across the former lakebed. Load after load of material went into creating ground that could carry recovery equipment. The site slowly changed from an isolated patch of wreckage among wet terrain into a place where a large excavation could actually be supported. Near the cockpit area, the team went further. They created a contained work zone around the forward wreckage. Water had to be pumped away so that personnel could work in a relatively dry excavation rather than constantly fighting seepage and saturated soil. By the 14th of October, the recovery work around the aircraft could proceed in earnest. The cockpit area demanded particular care because it was both the most heavily damaged part of the bomber and one of the places most likely to contain evidence of the missing crew. Major sections could not be moved until the ground around them had been opened and the water brought under control. This slowed the work, but it also preserved the reason the operation had been undertaken. Decades of mud had concealed wreckage, personal effects, and human remains that could not be understood from the surface alone. Clearing the site carefully gave the team a chance to recover more than recognizable pieces of B-24. The people at the site were not there only to move metal. Grave registration personnel were involved because of the missing crew. Explosive ordnance specialists also had reason to be present around the remains of a wartime bomber. Every stage had to deal with the fact that the wreck had spent decades buried in ground that could conceal material only a short distance from the visible airframe. The strange irony of the recovery became clearer as the work expanded. In 1943, Big Banner had disappeared because it landed in open water. In 1975, water was still one of the problems. It was no longer the Ysselmeer above the aircraft, but moisture and seepage inside the reclaimed ground around it. The lake had been removed on the scale of the landscape, yet pumps were still needed to create a workable dry area around the cockpit. And while the Dutch dug into the wreck, someone was preparing to return to it. Charles Taylor had survived Big Banner's last flight. For more than 30 years, the aircraft had existed for him only as the bomber from which he had escaped before becoming a prisoner of war. Now it had been found, identified, and exposed in the new polder. A Dutch television organization helped arrange for Taylor and his wife to travel to the Netherlands during the recovery. Gerrit Zwanenburg received him at the site. The physical contrast between his two visits could hardly have been greater. The last time Taylor had been with Big Banner, the aircraft was descending through cloud over a wartime Netherlands. It struck open water. He escaped into the Ysselmeer and was taken prisoner. 32 years later, he approached the same bomber across land. Around it were engineers, excavation equipment, pumps, and the long sand route built across the reclaimed ground. The water in which he had once fought to survive was no longer there. Taylor's presence gave the wreck a living connection that most wartime crash sites no longer had. The men around the excavation knew the aircraft from records, markings, and twisted structure. Taylor had known it as a working bomber. He had sat at its controls, flown the mission to Münster, and been inside it during the final descent. Now he was standing beside what remained. Zwanenburg later remembered Taylor looking at the wreck and repeating only a short phrase. "Oh boy, oh boy." There was no need for a longer speech. The aircraft in front of him was not a restored bomber polished for display. It was the damaged, corroded remains of the machine from which he had escaped in 1943. The excavation also carried Taylor toward a part of the story that had never been resolved. 5 of his crewmates had remained missing after the war. As recovery personnel worked through the site, human remains began to be found. Zwanenburg later said that he deliberately kept Taylor from seeing the remains of his former crewmates. The work continued around the wreck. One by one, the site began answering the question raised by the identification of 427638. 4 of the 5 missing men were located during the main excavation. The discovery changed the meaning of every piece of work that had gone into reaching the bomber. The 800-meter sand road, the pumped excavation area, and the heavy machinery had not merely opened access to a wartime aircraft. They had opened a site that wartime recovery had never been able to reach. But the search was not complete. Stanley Pilch was still missing. The 4 discoveries did not come with the neat certainty of a list being checked off in order. The site had been through impact, submersion, burial, and reclamation. The team had to establish identities from what could be recovered and from the wartime record tied to the aircraft. That is why the 5th missing man mattered so much. Until Pilch was found, the accounting that had begun on the day of the crash remained unfinished. Pilch was found only as the work was reaching its end. The final clearing produced the final missing member of the group. By this stage, the recovery had already established the identity of the aircraft and accounted for 4 men who had remained missing since 1943. It would have been possible for the site to become another case in which most of the questions were answered, but one name remained unresolved. The crews continued clearing the wreck area. On the final day of the operation, they found Stanley Pilch. After 32 years, the 5 men who had remained missing with Big Banner had all been accounted for. Only then could the physical recovery of the aircraft be understood in its proper scale. Large sections of the B-24 still had to be extracted from former lake bed that resisted the machinery trying to move them. Zwanenburg later recalled that tanks were used to help pull the wreckage out. It was an extraordinary end to a crash that had begun in open water. The bomber had been inaccessible because it was submerged. Then the lake had been drained away, exposing it. Yet even after that enormous change, The ground remained difficult enough that engineers had to build hundreds of meters of access, create a drained excavation pit, and bring heavy tracked machinery to the site. The water was gone, but the ground it left behind still controlled how the aircraft could be recovered. The operation formally concluded on the 19th of December 1975, almost exactly 32 years after Big Banner's final mission. The remains of the 5 recovered servicemen were returned to the United States for burial. Parts of the aircraft were preserved in museum and institutional collections in both the Netherlands and the United States. Big Banner would never return as a complete flying B-24. Its importance came from something else. The wreck had connected 3 different landscapes and 3 different moments in time. There was the wartime Ysselmeer of 1943, where a damaged bomber descended through cloud and a crew changed its plan from parachuting to ditching. There was the newly reclaimed polder of the late 1960s, where the structure of a B-24 appeared among reeds on ground that had recently been underwater. And there was the recovery site of 1975, where engineers built a road across former lake bed, and the sole survivor returned to the aircraft while investigators searched for men who had never come home. Pieces of Big Banner still survive. Material from the wreck entered Dutch museum collections, while components were also transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force. One of the bomber's Pratt & Whitney engines is preserved in the Netherlands. But the strongest surviving monument to the story is the place itself. In December 1943, Charles Taylor escaped from a wrecked B-24 into the waters of the Ysselmeer. Today, that same general location lies within Zuidelijk Flevoland. The aircraft did not make a journey from the bottom of a lake to dry ground. It stayed where it had fallen, while engineers, dikes, and pumping stations moved the boundary between water and land around it. That accident of geography eventually made the recovery possible. It still took years to identify the wreck, months of preparation to reach it properly, an 800-meter access route, pumps, excavation equipment, and heavy tracked vehicles to remove what remained. And after all of that, the most important things brought out of the former lakebed were not engines, guns, or sections of aluminum. They were the answers attached to 5 names. Big Banner disappeared beneath the Ysselmeer with 5 men still missing. 32 years later, the water was gone, the bomber was still there, and the search could finally reach them.